So, since it's the hour, why don't we get started? Um, Thank you all for joining this monthly meeting of the Standing Panel on Executive Organization and Management. Um, I'm delighted to be joined by two experts, but I see other similar experts have joined. So hopefully this can be a rich discussion. Um, and most of you know our speakers, Bill Hoagland, Senior Vice President of the Bipartisan Policy Center, but has decades under his belt of budget expertise. He was a staff director of the Senate Budget Committee, among other positions. Doug Criscitello, now a senior fellow for program integrity at Arnold Ventures, but also former CFO at HUD, SBA. Both have spoken frequently on the uh, topic of the federal budget, but I think it's fair to say there are more issues swirling around on the federal budget today than probably ever, which is saying something. Um, so I guess I'll ask you both just to make some introductory remarks, and then we're going to tick through reconciliation, rescissions, debt limit, approps, 26 approps. But this is a small group, so let's make it a discussion. Bill, you want to just open this up with some brief remarks?
Sure, fine. Thanks, Robert. First of all, I really dislike being referred to as an expert, and I'll tell you why. When I look at the people that are on this call here, many of you are as knowledgeable or more so than I ever will be. But particularly, I remember one of my first, one of the founders here at the Bipartisan Policy Center was Senator Bob Dole, and he used to refer to an expert as a drip under pressure, and I think that's my classification of an expert. Anyway, thank you for inviting me. I look forward to going through some things. I haven't prepared any specific remarks because things are changing as we speak. And I guess one last an acronym that I've come to enjoy using recently is an old military acronym in a firefight. It's VUCA, VUCA, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And that's kind of the way I describe the current budget situation today. So I look forward to going through some of the items, Robert, that you've outlined. Doug?
So I asked you, Bill, to be comforting in this, but you've gone off script. Doug, over to you.
Yeah, look, for those of us who've been around this world for decades now, the Congressional Budget Act recently turned 50, so we're in our 51st year now operating under that governing statute. I do think we're in uncharted waters to some extent on a number of topics that we're going to discuss, particularly on budget execution. Things are just different, and we can get into that, but a number of things are happening that the folks that administer the budget across government are really struggling to try to adapt to this strange new world. Um, uh, I've been working with a group, Steve Redburn's on the call, he's part of it, that have been putting our heads together to come up with suggestions for how the federal budget process might be reimagined. And it's been a struggle to figure that out. I was reminded by one of our colleagues this week of the famous Rudy Penner line, where he said the process, the budget process isn't the problem is the problem. And Congress routinely wants to spend more and tax less without regard to the implications for the future. So that's the problem, regardless of the process. So that's where we stand today. And in some respects, it's the same old problem, but there are quite a few new wrinkles to it.
Okay, so that sets us up beautifully. Let's tackle reconciliation. The Congress is trying to get this done before the July 4th recess. You want to talk about where we are and maybe make some predictions, Bill, starting with you?
Well, first of all, literally, we're not on. I've been one over here who has been rather pessimistic about the July 4th deadline. There's nothing magic about July 4th other than the president has set that as a date. The fact that we haven't even started in the Senate, and we're still, even as of this morning, we are still, the Senate parliamentarian is still going through provisions in the Senate tax bill. Would suggest to me that we still have a ways to go just before we can get to a bill. Now, they can start on a bill, obviously, and continue in the back room working on the substitute that would come at the end. But let's be clear, even if they get started on that this weekend, and yes, it's what, 20 hours of on the floor, and the Republicans yield back their 10 hours, that's still 10 hours. And then you have the wonderful vote-a-rama still. Maybe they can get it done in the Senate by early next week. And but what that tells me, if you really think July 4th, you want it on the president's desk, that means the House has to take literally take whatever the Senate passes. And I don't think that's in the cards at all. So this July 4th thing, chalk me up as I'm very pessimistic about it. Now, I've been wrong in the past and it could work out. The other thing that I want to point out as an old CBO, and Steve and others and John and others on this call here know, first of all, they don't have a bill. And then there will be those who will want to say, and what does it actually do and cost? And whether you use a current policy, a current law baseline, which has not been resolved either at today. I just looked up and made sure I wasn't misspeaking. When the House passed its one big beautiful bill back, what was it? I think around June the 4th. It took them 2 weeks before CBO had finalized all the estimates. So I'm just throwing that on top of this. So a long story short, besides the fact we still have big issues with things such as Medicaid. They are one thing, and I'll turn it over to Doug for his prognostications, but I'm defensive. I believe the Senate parliamentarian is doing her job. As we all know, reconciliation has evolved into a process by which has become a partisan process. I've looked back at, I think of the 23 reconciliation bills that have been enacted in the 51-year history. I think it's 23. I worked on 18 of those. Up until about 2010, there was bipartisanship in most of them. Now it's become so partisan and the margin's so small that senators and congressmen want to get their policy, not a budget issue. They want their policies done. And my hat goes off to Elizabeth McDougall for kind of sticking to what the process reconciliation is supposed to be. I carry around with me in one of my files here, a letter that Bob Byrd wrote when we were considering healthcare reform. And it made it very clear, and going back to the beginning of history, this is supposed to be a budget process. But so much of it has become, and where these so-called Byrd rule violations are occurring, appear to me to be in that category of, yeah, it has a budgetary consequence, but it's merely incidental to a broader policy goal.
Mm,
And that, to her credit, is sticking to the fact that this is supposed to be a budget fiscal process. So I'll stop there.
yeah. Doug,
Yeah,
also, if you could unpack this, the baseline debate, that would be helpful, I think, as well.
yeah. Well, yeah, I will. To pick up on Bill's point, not only has it become a partisan process, but it's increasingly being used to increase deficits rather than reducing them, which was clearly the intent of reconciliation in the 74 Act. The timing of this bill, and I understand there are long-term fiscal implications of the provisions included in this legislation, but this is the fiscal 25 reconciliation measure for a year that's I think we have about 65 days left in the July, August, more than that. Yeah. So we have about 95 days left in the fiscal year. But sort of like making a New Year's resolution in the last week of the year, at least for the current year, it's not being used in that way. So let's talk about the current policy baseline debate. So some have been advocating for using a baseline to score the impact of the legislation relative to current policy, the policies that are currently in place, many of which are slated to expire at the end of this year. So if you score relative to current policy, the cost is significantly lower than if you score it relative to current law. Under current law, these provisions are slated to expire. So if you want to re-up them relative to the current law baseline, the costs are very significant. And we're sort of living in bizarro land on this front where folks are they love the fact that when the Tax Cut and Jobs Act was put in place in 2017, it was, envisioned to expire in 2025. Many of the provisions were slated to expire in 2025. So the cost was significantly lower than if it had been extended for decades into the future. Now, there's a reason why it was done this way under the Byrd rule. Fiscal impacts can't extend beyond 10 years. So they had favorable scoring. Those, who are supportive of this tax cut package had favorable scoring back in 2017. Now they want favorable scoring again, where we assume that those tax cuts from 2017 were permanent. So that's where that stands. It's, again, it's misleading to score relative to current policy. But, I think overall, I guess the theme, any discussion about the U.S. budget process is going to talk about dysfunction and how the process is not working as intended. And I think reconciliation is an exemplar for this dysfunction, right? It's being used to achieve the opposite of its intended effect of deficit reduction, and increasingly it's being leveraged, to cut taxes and increase spending. So that's how I'm looking at it right now.
Great. Bill, you want to add something?
I want to pick up on two things. Number one, at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter whether it's current law or current policy. The bond market, the bond market will see what the final outcome is, and that is it's going to add to the deficit. Relative.
So it does matter. So it does matter, right? I mean,
Well, it matters in the sense of what the market might react.
yeah.
Uh,
I mean, they can't distort reality by calling it one thing or another.
That's right. I mean, the fact it'll come out. And by the way, the second thing is, though, I want to give credit. I want to give credit where credit is due to the House, Jody Arrington.
Hmm.
And they did use current law.
Right.
And the difference there in terms of current law versus what current policy is the amount that the House people are going to say, okay, you can do it that way if you want to, but then you're going to have to. This is the savings that we're expecting, $1.5 trillion in spending reductions. And then just one small point, Doug, I agree you with that the sense of reconciliation from the beginning was deficit reduction. Unfortunately, I don't think the law says that exactly.
Oh, agreed. Agreed.
And it's reconciliation. Bill Dowster and I have gone around on this so many times. The law simply says when it comes to make changes laws within your jurisdiction. It doesn't say up or down. And because of that, and I may be to blame. Look, I advised on this.
We're not going to dig up old bones, Bill.
Well, when in 2001, in January of 2001, when CBO, the outgoing Clinton administration, the incoming George W. Bush administration, the Alan Greenspan Fed were projecting surpluses as far as the eye could see in the spring of 2001. And because of that, and I know I'm not that good of an economist, but big surpluses can be as damaging to an economy as can big deficits. And so I'll never forget the day that Larry Lindsay came into Pete Domenech's office with me and said, let's return some of this surplus to the American public in the form of a tax cut. And not to create a deficit, but to reduce a surplus. That decision was made to use reconciliation. By the way, it passed a little bit. I think there was some bipartisan support for that, but it wasn't meant to create a deficit. It was to reduce a surplus. But that action, I think, Doug, set forth, well, hell, if you can use reconciliation to cut taxes, then you can do it. You can do it anytime you want to, or you can increase spending in reconciliation. So
it's interesting that so constraints like the Conrad rule, which was in place from I think 2007 to 2015, so it aimed to focus reconciliation on deficit reduction, right? But that's been abandoned. But it just seems, I think you raise a great point there on if you're in an era of surpluses, I think that's an absolutely fair point that reconciliation could be used to reduce the surplus. But in our current condition of just a 36, $37 trillion national debt, I think it's hard to imagine that the crafters of the 74 Act would have thought that, well, in a situation like we're in right now, let's provide expedited legislative procedures to allow that national debt to get larger.
Okay, let's move to another esoteric topic, rescissions and the Impoundment Act. This administration is testing the bounds of the law as much as far more than any in history. So talk about rescissions, pocket rescissions, and the prospects for successfully finding the Impoundment Act to be unconstitutional. Doug, starting with you.
Yeah, so impoundment, Bill, I'd be curious to know if you know of any statutory definition of impoundment. I was looking for one recently and could not find it. I
Oh.
ended up in OMB Circular A11, where I did find a definition of impoundment as any executive branch action or inaction that temporarily or permanently withholds, delays, or precludes the obligation of expenditure of budgetary resources. Statutorily,
GAO hasn't provided a similar definition in its.
oh, I'm sure that's a good point. I'm sure it has. You know, GAO regularly reports on impoundment, so I'm sure it's defined it as well. But in terms of the 74 Budget Act, the Impoundment Control Act, Title 10 of that statute.
I agree. In the Impoundment Control Act, you'll not find the word impoundment.
Right. So there's references to rescissions and deferrals.
That's right.
So those are the two types of sort of procedures that are laid out in the statute. And again, the rhetoric around the impoundment control being unconstitutional in that it somehow restricts executive branch authorities from the Constitution. You know, to me, that's a curious way to look at it, because the Impoundment Control Act provides a path for the president to not spend funds that have been provided by the Congress. And it's in partnership with the Congress, right? If the executive branch does not want to spend money, they send a message to the Congress. Congress can consider that request using expedited legislative procedures and agree to the reductions. But if it does not, and through the sort of formal legislative process, right? They need to pass a bill, president needs to sign it. But if they don't do that, the executive is compelled to obligate and spend the money. So here we are, as I mentioned, approaching the end of a fiscal year, and there are seemingly, and I think pretty clearly, large sums of money that have not yet been obligated or spent, or even earlier in the process. There haven't been notices of funding opportunities issued for some programs. So I think it's a safe assumption that there are large amounts of unobligated appropriations that are sitting around the executive branch of government. And that sort of leads to this question: what happens as we approach the end of the fiscal year? And this term, pocket rescissions, has come up. So it sort of mimics the concept of a pocket veto for legislation. If a Congress expires and the president hasn't signed legislation, well, it just, you know, that legislation is not passed. And the logic that some in the executive branch right now are using, that if either a request is sent too late in the fiscal year or one isn't sent at all, funds expire and become unavailable. So to me, and some folks have been quoted as saying that there is a provision in the Impoundment Control Act that allows this. There absolutely is not. I think it's antithetical to the intent of the Impoundment Control Act. It's hard to read through that title and arrive at the conclusion that, well, if you get to the end of the year and you haven't obligated the funds, then that's fine. So, Bill, do you have thoughts on that?
You said it's not authorized, but there are unobligated balances every year, right? So to what
Right.
if you have if unobligated balances have been tolerated in the past, this is just on a different scale. Is that right?
Well, I would argue typically that unobligated balances that have occurred in the past have been just sort of impoundments resulting from routine financial management, which are quite different than policy impoundments, where the executive branch has determined that some of the spending that was provided is at odds with administration policy. Therefore, we are not going to spend the funds.
Right.
I mean, personally, while working as a CFO in the federal government, I remember one program that was sort of put on the agency by the Congress to spend. The amount was $1 billion. Spend this money this year. And, I can tell you the policy officials at the agency were not interested in trying to roll out a new program that was poorly designed, that would likely result in huge amounts of abuse. But there was no choice. It had to be done. We did it. The program was an abject failure. But again, that was the mindset we were in there. The Congress has provided these funds. The president signed the bill. It's our job to execute the budget. This administration is using a whole lot of discretion to decide. And maybe I didn't give a great example there because I think this was a poorly crafted program. Yet, the commitment to following the law was there, and we felt that we had no choice. Particularly if Congress denied any rescission request.
Bill?
Just bringing it to today.
Yeah.
Any of you who watched or listened to the hearing a couple of days ago in the Senate Appropriation Committee with Russ Vought will know that this is a big issue right now. And the president's request of 9.2, I believe, billion in rescissions, just where I think things stand. Let's back up for just a second. Earlier, when Elon Musk was putting forth all these reductions and forth, I was struck by, apparently he went up to the Hill and was meeting with Lindsey Graham. And Lindsey Graham said to him, about the rescission process. And it's been reported, I assume it's true, that he said, I don't know anything about that. I'm a businessman. Chairman of the Budget Committee said, well, you have a process. It's called the rescission process. Now, I'd like to have been on the corner in the room listening when he went back and told Russ Vought, hey, why aren't you using the rescission process? Because Russ literally, and he's a friend, but we have big differences. He has been very clear from the last Trump administration that the Impoundment Control Act is unconstitutional. I mean, he's telegraphed that completely. So here's where I'm speculating.
Yeah.
So he puts forth the $9 billion, basically USAID and Corporation for Public Broadcasting. He puts that forth. House acts on it quickly. Of course, they can. Simple majority. Sends it over to the Senate. Senate's in the midst of doing reconciliation. They don't want to take the time, which I think, as I recall,
45 days.
Yeah, 10 hours, I think, like that too.
Mm.
So they're now, after that hearing with the appropriators, I'm sure if there is a reported rescission bill post 4th of July, it will be different than what the House sent over. It will be modified in some ways. Maybe Corporation Broadcasting taken out. I don't know. PEPFAR, a Republican, a George W. Bush, Bill Frist program will be protected somehow. Long story short, they report that out after the 4th of July. I'm hoping all these experts that are on the line here now can clarify for me. I don't recall the last time we had a rescission package in the Senate that then is different than what the House is, that wasn't kind of negotiated within the appropriations behind the scenes to stay under the caps. But if they report that out, I'm beginning to get the impression the time clock runs out on July the 17th or 18th, that maybe the Senate jams the House, or nothing, or more importantly, it expires. And under the law, then he has to release the money. My guess is that in some ways, Mr. Vaught is going to say, see, that's why the act doesn't work, and that's why I'm going to use now this recess pocket rescissions at the end of the year.
Right.
I think it's terrible. I think it's unconstitutional. But again, I go back, Doug and Robert, the law isn't exactly clear on this, about this end of the, I mean, the sentiment is there. It shouldn't be, but again, I don't know that Russ and company can't get away with then okay, we're going to do pocket rescissions at the end of the year, and they're going to be big.
What's the recourse? What, there are two instances in which GAO has already called out violation of the Impoundment Act: transportation and museum and library services. Do those have any impact on? Can the courts have ruled on this by then? And what impact would it have on a pocket rescission situation?
I'm not a lawyer. I don't want to speculate. I will say, this House Legislative Appropriation Act does have a provision in there that takes away the authority of GAO to bring suit. I don't think that's going to make it through the end of the day. I'd really like to hear what Mark has to.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't see your hand up, Mark.
You can continue the conversation. I just have a question whenever.
Yeah, go ahead.
I haven't been following this very closely. I guess I have a specific question. I think, Doug, you had characterized under impoundment, there's kind of like this difference between doing it for a policy reason versus what you said is like financial management purposes. Yeah. But financial management purposes is actually a very narrow, like, instance that there is a broader, what about when you're taking management actions that lower the cost of delivery, which we all want there to be an incentive to do, whether you're, reducing kind of a waste, fraud, and abuse, you find a different way, or maybe like technology has evolved. And so like when it was appropriated, here was like the cost estimate that you got the amount, but you decide you can do it with less staff in a faster way. I mean, that should enable you to have a balance at the end of the year that you let expire. Like that's the most positive framing possible, even to what some of the like Doge and others are doing. And it's a little unclear to me how that stuff gets like wrapped up in this like discussion about like what's impoundment and what's not.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Mark. And yeah, the statute could maybe provide more clarity on that front. One example I have along those lines is so running the financial operations of a large department, my staff in the budget office was very concerned about Anti-Deficiency Act violations, to the point where hiring, when staff left, they wouldn't post a job until the person walked out the door. So if that's your operating procedure, at the end of the year, you're going to have more money for personnel compensation than you actually spent. And we used to catch heat from the appropriations subcommittees on that front. We tried to tighten it up the best we could. But it is worth mentioning the Anti-Deficiency Act here, because the folks that run the finances of government are very concerned with complying with that statute, because it has both civil and criminal penalties for violating it. Unlike the other power of the purse statute, the Impoundment Control Act, which provides no penalties.
Bill, do you have a reaction to that at all? Okay. Okay, so moving on to the debt limit, this, I don't know how long, Bill, you thought this was important to raise. Do you want to talk about where we are on the debt limit?
Just, we do this thing, and others in CBO now and others do, on the statutory debt limit. And it's called the X date. And just a little bit of history there. About 12 years ago, 10 years ago, we had a gentleman that worked for us for $1 a day, and his name was Jay Powell. And he helped us develop this little model that we call the X date. We should have patented, I guess. But we didn't.
I'm
And
going to give it to my daughters.
yeah. So we ended up creating this little model, and we've used it ever since, and thanks to Jay Powell. And part of it, so we just issued our latest after we got the quarterly receipts coming in. And our current estimate is that sometime between August the 15th, right in the middle of August recess, and October the 3rd, we're going to sometime in that time frame, we will default. Now, if this big beautiful bill comes to pass, forget it. We're adding $4 or $5 trillion, and it's not going to be an issue. But I raise it as if this one big beautiful bill starts to running into some problems here, and they are not able to get it pulled together by the beginning of the August recess, then there may be pressure to pass it freestanding. Obviously, that's not what Republicans want, because if they have to pass it freestanding outside of reconciliation, that means they have to negotiate with Democrats. That's the last thing they want. But all of this reminds me of 2023, when we were to raise the debt limit, and McCarthy had to negotiate, and we set caps for discretionary spending for 24 and 25. Remember, we don't have caps now for 26 coming up. So this debt limit issue could become the negotiating, and it's working, Robert, to get segue to 26 appropriations.
Yeah.
But
Beautiful.
this could be similar to 23, when debt limit became the basis upon which you set the appropriations for 20.
Right.
Then 24 and 25, now it would be for 26 going forward. I just thought, again, if reconciliation passes, it's not an issue, but then it sets up, well, what about appropriations for 26, which are really going to be tough.
So, Bill, just on the debt limit, though, multiple reconciliation bills for 25 could move. So if the one big bill doesn't pass, they could break out a separate reconciliation measure that just addresses the debt limit.
I have argued that. Some people tell me that won't pass, freestanding, and Republicans won't support that. But I agree with you that's the solution.
Technically possible.
Technically possible. Yeah.
Under once again, under expedited legislative consideration.
Yeah.
Right.
So it'd be filibuster proof in the Senate.
Right.
Do you have additional points to add on the debt limit, Doug?
I mean, we could get into the nitty-gritty of what would happen if we pass the X date, but there's a whole lot of speculation involved with assessing how the executive branch would operate in such an instance. So,
do the models you're talking about, Bill, take into account this reduced spending that we anticipate? I bet not, right? Because you can't really plug those in.
It wouldn't include. No, it wouldn't.
Yeah, so that's a factor, right? That's a factor.
That's right. One thing that
although those won't materialize until September.
That's
right?
true.
September.
Right. The one thing that, and I certainly hope this isn't the case, every time we get to this, and I got to Steve's question, hands
Yes,
up.
yes, sir. Yeah.
Steve, before I do that,
I
every
was
time,
ignoring him. I was ignoring him intentionally. Just
every time we get to this situation in the past, somebody raises the amendment, the 14th Amendment, Section 4, the validity of the public debt of the United States shall not be called into question. Given, and our president doesn't seem to be worried about debt and deficits, and in fact has argued to do away with the statutory debt limit.
right.
I wonder, it would be unprecedented, of course, whether or not the president and some of his lawyers don't pull out the 14th Amendment and say, it doesn't matter, we'll still issue the debt. It's okay.
Steve,
Oh,
my friend.
hi. Just to think the unthinkable for a minute here about this. And Doug started to go down this path, but it's hard to go. Mentally, it's hard to go down this path. But what if, by mistake, most likely, or because they can't agree, there is a default? The conventional view is that it's impossible to prioritize the government's obligations. Technically very difficult, but Treasury might be able to manage that. Would this administration perhaps have a different approach and guarantee certain payments, like payments to debt holders, Social Security, whatever, and then the rest would be lower priority?
But Steve, could you how do you
Yeah.
define default?
Default meaning that, well, the X date, let's say,
Okay, so
when
not
no longer pay all
He's
the
like
obligations in a timely way.
right. A sovereign debt default means one thing, the government not being able to honor its commitments in a timely fashion. Some would argue they're the same thing. I think there is a distinction.
Well, I won't get into the theology of it, but it does seem to me as a practical matter, you can prioritize obligations and slow the rate of cash flowing out of the Treasury in order to stay within the borrowing.
Sort of like
And incidentally-
selective default is what you're basically saying.
Well, and incidentally, apparently that's happening across government right now,
But it's,
where
it's not affecting
agencies are
borrowing.
not obligating funds, and OMB is pointing to the looming X date as the reason.
Right.
Whew. This
Yeah.
is like budget gumbo. My God.
As we shift to 2026, I think it's worth considering why Congress has been completely complicit in all of the actions that the executive has taken. 20 years ago, the appropriators would have been furious and all over the challenge to their authority to decide what to spend and what not to spend. None of that. It's a very strange
I
situation.
guess, Steve, that OMB would, at least Russ would argue, my mini budget was the appropriation request for 26. He will argue. I would argue they have not yet submitted a budget for fiscal year 26. That's stupid. But he will argue, I've given them what they need to do their appropriations bills, and that's why some of the appropriation bills have started in the House already. But
Yeah,
I see a CR coming, at best a CR.
yeah. Just one point on the budget request that was set up. It's enormously difficult looking at that document to try to figure out what's happened in 25, which makes it difficult for the appropriators to provide 26 funding. In particular, if you just look at personnel compensation at various agencies that have been downsized, you don't see reductions in the current year on spending for staff because most of them are being paid through the end of the year. So
Right.
it's really challenging to figure out, sort of how do you maintain the level of government that we have now into the next year.
So y'all have run away with the agenda. We've just sort of slid it into FY26 budget. Anything else to say on that topic?
We were talking about what happens at the end of the year. We hit September 30. And, I know some in the in the Democrat caucus were upset with the decision to accept a remainder of year continuing resolution here in 25 back in March. I think it's really it's concerning how the executive branch might interpret the Anti-Deficiency Act in 26 if it's forced to operate under a shutdown. And, we can look at the first Trump presidency, and I think the operations by and large were consistent with how other administrations had operated during a shutdown. Some folks have pushed back on me on that, but if you want to try to liberally interpret the president's authorities under the Anti-Deficiency Act in the event of a shutdown to sort of deem which portions of government are, the term that's usually used is essential. The D's might be taking a big gambit there because the language is, there are some broad categories about protecting life and property that you could cram a lot of activities into those areas. So I think
Right.
You're suggesting, yes, sir. Yep,
Whether NAPA and you have looked at this, but when I went back, even under the Anti-Deficiency Act, Doug, now almost 200 years old, almost. Yeah. Has there ever been a case brought under the Anti-Deficiency Act to penalize anybody?
That's an interesting question because it certainly got the fear of God in people. It's just sort of the mystique.
Everyone wants to avoid budget jail, but I don't think anyone's gone there. That's
fascinating. But so what you're suggesting, Doug, is that the only alternative at this stage is a continuing resolution, right? Because we're so late in the FY26 process, the administration has submitted a budget piecemeal. And as you mentioned, Bill, the appropriators are underway. But under no scenario would they get anything done before September. So you're suggesting we might have a shutdown and that the administration would take that as an opportunity to interpret the Anti-Deficiency Act expansively, fund its priorities, but not the rest of government.
Possible. I'm just saying there's a possibility of that occurring. I'm not saying it's a likelihood, but clearly this president has tested the boundaries of emergency powers.
Right.
We've seen that. And it could apply here going forward for fiscal 26 if the D's are not willing to sort of work with the executive, with the Republicans to effectuate a continuing resolution.
Can I add? I know we're running out of time.
No, we're not. No, we're not. We got all the time in the world.
Dig into this just a little bit more. I'm looking at the mini budget.
Yeah.
And I'm looking at the non-defense discretionary request from the administration for non-defense at $560 billion. And I'm looking at their own table, Doug, that has the 25, which I think is the basis upon the continuing resolution.
Yeah.
At $720 billion. In other words, a reduction of 163. In some ways, could I argue that we'd be better, that agencies would be better off under a continuing resolution at the 25 level than
I don't think there's any question. Not that the budget would be enacted as proposed, but it would certainly be better than what's been proposed. DOD and civilian.
Yeah, but look, I mean, you could make that case for many president's budgets that have been sent to the Hill, right? The status quo, a CR would be better. A current services baseline budget would be preferable to the president's budget. And yeah, I think that is true. But again, how often do we hear that the president's budget is dead on arrival? We didn't exactly hear that this year. But Robert, as you're fond of pointing out, there are Democrats, there are Republicans, and there are appropriators, right? So
Yeah.
we'll see if that dynamic persists into FY26. I see
Steve,
John
Oh.
Kamensky asked a question about only one reconciliation bill per fiscal year. And again, Bill, I'll ask you this. I mean, I've looked at I mean, both the statute and sort of practices through the years. Reconciliation bills can include spending, revenues, and or debt limit.
Debt limit. You can do three bills.
So
for
there could
reconciliation.
be 3 bills. It's just a matter of, for one thing, we need to extend the debt limit. If I'm working at the White House, I want the debt limit to accompany the one big bill. I don't want it broken out separately because that exerts pressure toward getting a legislative package of the bigger bill.
Yeah, historically, from what I can remember, yeah, you can do 3 bills. We've had a tax bill, we've had a spending bill over the years, but historically, you put them all together. And a lot of that, quite frankly, has to do with logistic timing. You just don't have time
Right.
to do 3 reconciliation bills. That would dominate the entire first session of a Congress anyway.
Steve?
There's another consequence of operating under a continuing resolution that I know Doug has noted, but that most other people have not, and that is that with regular appropriations, you get a lot of detailed guidance and instruction in accompanying reports and so on. And of course, the language itself is modified from year to year. Here, when you're looking back to 2024, or even next year, if we're looking back to 2025 in a continuing resolution, there's a lot more flexibility on the part of the executive to do what they want within the constraints of the appropriations language of 2024, whatever that happened to be. And also, I'd note that the 2026 problem is made further complicated because a lot of the increases for defense and for Homeland Security are actually in the reconciliation bill, substantial amounts. Well over $100 billion for defense, for example.
For 25.
Well, I think that's for 2026, isn't it? That's a good question. Maybe it is 2025. In any case, it's a big hunk of money that would presumably carry over into 2026. And there's another complication too, which is that if you wanted to find a way to allow the government to spend these unspent balances in 2026, Congress the appropriators could provide language to that effect, but that would score against their allocations for 2026, and therefore they'd be squeezed for other things. So it's an unprecedented and complicated situation, I think.
Well, and let's give you, I mean, you talked about allocations for 26. So needless to say, given the fact we've just recently passed a fiscal 25 budget resolution, we're a long ways from getting a 26 budget resolution
Don't count on it.
So the
Don't count on
allocations
getting
don't
one.
exist yet. Right? So we're a year behind. We're actually more than a year behind in our planning for a 1-year budget. It's a very odd dynamic that we're living in right now.
So our friend Phil, do you want to make this point about the cost of the personnel costs?
Yeah, I'd like to hear that, Phil. It's an interesting point in the chat. Phil?
Yeah, hey, sorry, I was looking for my mute button there. Sorry.
That's right. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, so first of all, really appreciate the discussion here. I'm at Department of Energy in the loan programs office, and there is from the front line here, there's still a lot of uncertainty on what flexibilities we would have on staffing. You know, we've obviously we've had a lot of reductions in our federal team. We're aware of our trajectory from administrative, the proposed administrative budget that we might have looking forward. But as we're trying to create a an operating model that still is effective, we're trying to move boxes around to the extent that we can, knowing that we're also still restricted from any kind of a reorganization. And so as missions continue and we look to backfill critical roles, there is still a lot of uncertainty just on the ground. And so just wanted to share that that still is something that creates some challenges for managing to mission.
Hey, could I ask Phil, apropos of this? I had thought that the Supreme Court's the case in terms of the freeze on that was blocked by some of the judges already. I thought there would be a ruling today, but my understanding is it hasn't even been, the argument hasn't even been for the Supreme Court. So there won't be a ruling today when they go out. That pushes that case out to next fall. Does that create additional uncertainty as to your hiring? And
well, that certainly would. I just am aware that the guidance from the head of our human capital is that with the injunction in place, there can be no reorganizations. And so then we're in a somewhat of a state of limbo for organizational constructs that have seen an unplanned set of reductions in staffing that have created gaps in key capabilities. And I'm sort of speaking broadly, right? I mean, this is not unique to our organization, but would be the case in every federal organization that's created an incentive structure for folks to depart without, a thoughtful planned strategy for continued operations. So trying to work through that is, presents a set of challenges, and we're looking at the levers that we have available to us. But again, thanks for the discussion. It's good to hear the broader context. It's helpful to put our, our limited view in the larger perspective.
You're one of the few on the call confronting these realities on the ground.
Yeah.
Any other questions, comments, folks? I mean, this is
one small thing going way back up to the rescissions, Robert.
Yeah.
The Senate Appropriation Democratic staff, Mrs. Murray's staff, are keeping a running tally of what they say is appropriations that have been put on hold that might be the impoundment that they would define as impoundment.
Yeah.
And the last tally on that, Doug, I don't know if you have it, but it was $425 billion.
Right.
Wow.
That has already been put on hold or delayed, or which I would read as an impoundment.
Right.
And I got myself in trouble with some comments that I made recently with my own staff here that I was overstating that OMB was violating the law, but I still think they are violating the law.
Right. On a scale that's just tremendous, right?
Yeah, at $425 billion.
That's real money. Yeah.
Well, it's a huge percentage of discretionary spending. I mean, it's
strictly discretionary.
25% or
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's important to point out that the impoundment procedures that we've been talking about, rescission in particular, only applies to discretionary programs, appropriated dollars. So there's a big chunk of the budget, the mandatories, that are not subject to this at all.
Wouldn't you expect the same continued impoundments in a CR for 26?
Yes.
I think the answer is yes, right?
Yes.
Well, let me take a contrary view on that. Just, I'm not saying that this is true, but the continuing resolution that we're now operating under is based, lots of anomalies and adjustments, but it's based on 24 levels when Biden was president. Now, heading into 26, it's a Republican Congress, a Republican president. They're going to come together to pass something that funds the government wouldn't you expect the White House to be more compliant at that point?
I think you should, I don't know if you didn't, Doug, listen to the testimony before appropriations. That was exactly Senator Collins' comment. You signed the continuing resolution for fiscal year 25 that had that money in there. Why did you not?
Right. Okay.
That's you. It's your admin. That's not Biden. That you signed the 25 continuing
Yeah.
resolution.
Yeah, I've made that point continually. Again, this funding that's in place, and particularly it's true for 25, it's going to be particularly true for 26. It's a joint agreement. I don't like when folks say the Congress has directed that you spend X dollars. It's the Congress in partnership with the president have directed that an agency spend X dollars.
But that was many months ago.
Yeah.
Can't a man change his mind?
Yeah.
When will the appropriators wake up and assert their traditional authority, Bill? You must have some sense of how far they are willing to let them go.
Steve, been waiting for that for a long time myself, but I do think this rescission package of the 9 billion, at least for the Senate, I think they're starting to wake up to.
But that's
wait a
peanuts
minute,
compared to $400 billion.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, but again, I mean, we sort of loop back to the prospect of pocket rescissions, right? They could send up a huge package in September, late September even, that sort of they've aggregated all of the unobligated balances around the government and basically say we're not spending this, unless legislation is enacted forcing us to. So yeah, might we see another very large or a large rescission package later this year? That's an open question.
Well, if they take longer on appropriations, that gets even more problematic. There's too much on the plate already, so I don't think that's going to happen. It's easier for them just to let it all lapse at the end of the year, and we won't know how much until we get audited financial statements, right?
Well, but you lose the legalistic argument of pocket rescissions, which again, I don't think they have that authority, but if they want to rest on that, they actually need to send a rescission request up.
Right. But
And they've actually just changed the financial statement audit policy significantly. I don't know if you saw that, Steve.
what? Say that again?
They've changed the financial statement audit policy significantly to very narrow the scope of the financial statement audit.
Oh, no, I don't know. It's still due 45 days after the end of the year?
Well, it's that's at OMB's discretion, of course. So, anyway, but that's another EOM panel meeting. So, this has been a luxurious wade through these topics. As menacing as these issues are, it's y'all have discussed them with expertise. Can I say expertise rather than expert, Bill? And clarity. So, really grateful for your time. Stay in touch. Have a great weekend. Take care, everybody.